Paula from Plantland again here on Facebook, and hopefully later today, maybe on YouTube. We're going to do Vegetable Gardening 101 today. And today's class is going to be a little bit longer, and we're going to talk about some of the very basic things about starting a vegetable garden, because it's clear that a lot of people are doing it for the first time this year. So a lot of this information is going to be aimed more towards novice gardeners than it is towards experienced gardeners. Although as an old experienced gardener, I like to say that I learn something new all the time. Vegetable gardening, there's lots of good reasons to grow your own vegetables. The first one that I like to think of mostly being the fact that once you've had produce that you've picked yourself and eat either standing right there in the garden or 10 minutes later you cut it up and put it on the dinner table, it tastes a lot better than the stuff in the supermarket, because the supermarket stuff, the varieties are chosen so that they can be picked a little green, they're picked so they can ship well, they're picked so they can sit in a bin well. So it's not necessarily something that's a good vegetable to eat compared to stuff you grow yourself. The second reason is lots of people like to have lots of control from start to finish of the process of growing their vegetables. Now, we're not going to take questions while I'm talking during this. We're going to, Michelle's going to write all those questions down, and we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. The reason for that is some of the questions we get are off the topic I'm talking about, and I'm really trying to stay on topic here. You see, I don't work from very many notes. I tend to do this kind of off the top of my head, and sometimes when I get asked questions, it throws me. Although I do have a few notes today. So, those are the reasons why you want to start vegetable gardening. The next thing for anybody to consider is how they're going to accomplish vegetable gardening in terms of the site they have, in terms of site selection. Most of the advice that we're going to give you about things like soil testing and fertilizing and water, those things apply whether you're gardening in a container or whether you're gardening in the ground. But site selection is important for both those things also, because most vegetables require anywhere from 6 to 8 hours of good sunlight a day. And good sunlight is sunlight that comes from about 11 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon or later. Morning sun, which we think of as the sun from about 7 to 8 in the morning to about 11, is a much weaker sun. Afternoon sun, which we think of as coming from about 5 in the summer till 7 or 8 o'clock at night, can be a very, it's a weaker sun in some ways, it's a stronger sun in other ways. So we're talking about all good midday sun that you want for your vegetables. Now, a handful of vegetables you can grow in light shade. And what we mean by light shade is they're going to get some sun, but they're not going to get that ideal 6 to 8 hours of midday sun. This is true for a lot of the leafy vegetables like lettuces and kales and spinach. It's true for a lot of the root vegetables like carrots and beets. It's not true for any of the vegetables that have to produce a flower and then a fruit. So you could do some of your garden in a little bit lighter sun, a little bit light shade, and the rest of your garden in fuller sun. So site selection is a really important thing. The next thing to think about is your actual soil and how healthy it is. If you've been gardening a long time, you probably have a pretty good garden plot and it's pretty good soil and it's all in good shape. If you're just tilling up some new soil this year, you're going to want to get into soil testing to try and make sure that you know what you're doing. Now, we're going to do an actual little 10-minute class just on soil testing later this week, but I'll give you a quick overview of it. There are all kinds of little kits available. This is a kit that we sell here at Plantland called a Rapid Test. So what this is you get the little tubes, you get the little capsules that contain the agent that you're going to use to test the soil, and you get, well, you don't you don't get the water. When you're doing soil testing, it's really important that you use what's called DI water, distilled water. Distilled water has a neutral pH. If you use your tap water, especially if you have city water or if you have water that's being treated, that water has its own separate pH and that will influence your soil test. So these guys are pretty simple to use. You basically put the agent in the bottom of the tube, put soil in to the first line of the tube, put water into the second line of the tube, dump the little capsule in, then you seal it up and shake it. This is a soil sample I took purposefully to take some soil that I knew was going to test really alkaline. This is from a really clay section of soil. On the back of the soil testing, you'll see color charts. I'm going to step a little closer to the camera. Michelle's going to tell me if that's good. You'll see color charts here, and you'll see that this tests out at about 8.0 at the highest alkaline we have. That's because this was basically clay soil I put in this tube. And the reason I did that is a lot of us have clay soil. So you need to talk about soil amendments and all that sort of thing. And we're going to do that when we do the soil testing class. Just generally speaking though, most of your vegetables need a fairly neutral pH, which is somewhere around 7.0. We do have handouts on our website, plant-land.com, that talk specifically about soil testing and specifically about the pH requirements of each plant. The reason we worry about pH so much before we worry about the other things, which I'm going to talk about real quickly, the pH of your soil affects greatly how your plant is able to uptake nutrients. So you could have a soil that's very rich in nitrogen, very rich in phosphorus and potassium, the other three elements. But if your soil pH is too high or too low, your plants aren't going to be able to access those nutrients. And so that's why soil pH is usually the most important one. If you have an established garden, you can just use a simple pH test every year to make sure that your pH is staying in the range that you want it to. If you're starting a new garden, you can use a big test kit so that you can test lots of areas of your garden. And typically what we tell people that don't want to test every single plot where they're putting every single vegetable is to just take some soil samples from different spots in the garden, mix those soil samples together and test that soil sample. I don't want to get too hung up on soil sampling here. DI water, by the way, you can purchase this. This is the water, distilled water that you buy for your iron if you don't, if you still iron clothes. I don't know, many people don't. Or for a vaporizer. It's that kind of water that's a neutral pH and is untreated. So soil, the other thing we need to know about our soil is we never want our soil to be too wet or too dry to work. This time of year, now we've had a very, very dry winter, and at least at my yard down on Flathead Lake, my soil is very, very dry despite the moisture we've just gotten. So it'd be very easy to work my soil right now. When we say soil is too wet to work, it's the same test we use for a lot of things. If you pick up a handful of soil and you squeeze it in your fist, it should hold together when you open your hand. If it's too wet, you'll see water running out of your hand, and that's a sign that you shouldn't work your soil. Working your soil, we mean using a rototiller or digging or doing any kind of cultivating in your soil. If you do it when the soil is too wet, what you can end up doing is destroying the texture, the tilth of your soil. If you do it when it's too dry, like a lot of it is right now, you also can end up destroying the texture or the tilth of your soil. This is mostly true when you're using rototillers more than hand tilling. So too dry is when you put it in your fist and squeeze it, and when you open your fist it just falls apart. It needs to stay in a ball that you could toss from hand to hand. So we'll talk more about soil amendments. One of the things that people here in Montana are really lucky to get their hands on is manure. Lots of people, and I used to when I had a huge garden, used to do lots of amending my soil with sheep manure. We used to have friends that had a big sheep farm and they had a sheep manure party every year, although that's not how we called it on the invitations. Anyway, manure is a really good thing to use, but you need to make sure that it's aged. It needs to be at least a year or so old. So if somebody's just cleaning out their horse barns or pens this spring, all of that manure is probably going to be too hot. It's going to decompose too fast and at too high of a temperature and have too much uric acid in it to be safe to put on your garden for your tender plants. So they probably have manure piles from last year. Those are the ones you want to get manure off of, or you want to store some of that fresher manure for use later in the season. The other kinds of amendments you can use, we'll talk more in the soil testing class. I just want to kind of get through a bunch of different stuff here for this vegetable gardening thing. I'm really lucky. I have a friend that gave me this year for Christmas gave me this Victory Garden pamphlet. It's from 1943, and it's just a marvel of graphic design. It has a wheel inside where you put the vegetable you want to grow here, and then you look up on these tables that are on it the things that you need to do for that vegetable. I think we're going to reproduce a form of this for Plantland. But it goes to show you that you can find lots of garden information in pretty compact sources. I mean, this will tell you how to grow just about everything. Sorry, lost my book.
The gardening book?
Yeah, that's okay. The next thing to talk about for new gardeners is picking what you're going to plant. People are buying massive quantities of seeds and massive quantities of seed potatoes and stuff. And the truth is, some real talk here, unless you've got a greenhouse and unless you've got a plot about the size of a football field, you probably don't need to buy 20 packages of bean seeds. You probably don't need to buy 100 pounds of potatoes. Potatoes are a good example I like to use when you're trying to figure out how much of something to grow to feed your family over the summer. If you stop and think for a minute, how many 10-pound bags of potatoes do I buy in a year? If the answer is less than 10, you really only need to grow about 100 pounds of potatoes, which you can get from a very small amount of seed potatoes, as we talked about last week. The other thing is something like corn. Every year I buy a 25-pound box of corn from one of the Hooterite stands. When I take that corn and take it off the cob and freeze it, that 25 pounds of ears of corn provides enough corn for my husband and I to enjoy that all through the winter. Now, we're not eating corn every night of the week, but we don't usually run out of it before sometime in summer. So when you're planting your garden, you need to think about the size of your family and the size of the yields you want to make. The other kinds of things to consider when you're thinking about the kind of plants you want to plant. I have 2 tomato plants here. This is a Roma tomato plant, and this is a Better Boy tomato plant. Now, a Better Boy is the kind that's meant for fresh eating. This is something you'd slice up to put on a hamburger or you put in a salad. It's not something that's going to produce tons and tons of sauce for preserving. Whereas a Roma is the kind of tomato that I grow because all I really want is to produce sauce. I grow 6 Roma tomato plants every year, and that yields me about 12 to 16 quarts of my own good Italian grill sauce every year. So that gives you an idea of the kind of scale you're looking to do in your home gardening. And it also gives you the idea that you need to be careful about plant selection, that you need to know a little bit, and that's usually on your plant tags that you see in the plant. It's going to tell you it's a paste tomato or a sauce tomato. It's going to tell you it's a fresh eating tomato. So those are things that you need to consider when you're thinking about your garden and what you're going to plant, and that all goes back into how much space you're going to need. So I'm going to whip through a few other things really fast. When you've got your garden all planted, and you're going to plant your garden at different times, we're also going to do a class sometime this week about what you can be doing in the garden now. And we're going to try and continue that through the garden season. So we'll have a weekly what you should be planting, what you're doing in the garden now. You're not going to plant your tomatoes at the same time you're going to plant your cabbage. You're not going to plant your eggplant at the same time you're going to plant your lettuce. There are some things that can be planted very early before the ground is fully warm, and then there are lots of things that need to be planted later when both the ground is warm and all danger of frost is past. Here in northwest Montana, our frost-free season runs from somewhere in about mid-May to somewhere in mid-September. And that varies depending where you live in the valley. Down on Flathead Lake, we get a little longer growing season. If you live up on Lion Mountain, you're not going to get quite as long of a growing season. So you're going to be working in the garden planting different things at different times. Something like spinach, lettuce, and kale can go out fairly early. They can go out, we don't want to be getting hard frost when some of these things are out, but we can get light frost, and we can use simple frost protection. For example, spinach If you put spinach out early and we were having frost, this is called a hot cap. Boy, this is something I remember getting at the old garden center with my grandpa. This is a wax paper cap that you put over your plants on cold nights. You anchor it with a little bit of soil or some rocks, and that little bit of protection will get something like spinach through a cold night. It's not going to get something really tender like basil through a cold night. Basil is going to turn black and flip out if frost just winks at it. So you can't use these strategies to protect all plants equally in your garden. And of course, because we like to talk about reduce, reuse, and recycle, you don't have to purchase things like this. You can use things like a milk jug with the lid screwed off during the hot times of the day. You can use to protect a large quantity of plants, something like an old sheet or an old blanket. But you want to have some kind of cold protection strategy here in Montana. And that has to do with those different times that you're going to be planting different things. The next thing to talk about really quick is weed control. So you've got this big garden that you've made, and I am going to talk about container gardening too, but I'm still trying to get through my little list. Weed control. So if you have lots of weeds in your garden, they're competing with your plants for both water and nutrients. And in some cases, they can actually grow high enough to shade your plants out, and they're not going to be getting enough sun. So weed control becomes very important. Mechanical weed control is typically the best way to control weeds in your garden. And by that we mean pulling weeds, hoeing weeds, and the use of mulch. You can mulch your paths. You can mulch with garden fabric, the kind of stuff that we use in the floors of Plantlands greenhouses, the Typar and Sunbelt. You can mulch with wood chips. You can mulch with grass clippings if you know you haven't put any weed-killing chemicals on your grass clippings. I always like to make that warning because those weed-killing chemicals on your grass clippings then become plant-killing chemicals in your garden. So if you're using grass clippings, make sure you're not using lawn chemicals. Weed control is something that's going to be an ongoing thing you're going to have to do in your garden. It's one of the advantages of growing in containers or growing in raised beds, that weed control is not as much of an issue. Almost all my stuff now is grown in raised beds or containers. The next thing I want to go over very quickly is pest control. Well, before I leave weed control, I'm going to remind you that all of those chemicals that you use to control weeds on other places on your property, something like Roundup or even stuff that's organic like vinegar or salt, those are going to kill your garden plants as quickly as they kill the weeds. So we don't usually use any kind of chemical weed killers in our vegetable garden. It's almost 100% mechanical weed control. The next thing to move on to is pest control. There's a variety of diseases and pests that can bother things in our garden. Now we're also going to do a class on chemicals at some point, but a very quick overview here is to just say, if you want to stay organic, there are lots of good organic choices to make. Personally, that's the choice I make in my garden. But I don't hesitate to use some of the inorganic things when I know I have to control a problem. Most of the inorganic chemicals that you're going to use, typically, if you're using them early enough in the cycle, early enough in the season, they're not going to be at any detectable levels in the fruit that you're going to produce on your plants. It's important to remember that. You wouldn't use them very close to harvest, however. As far as any other kinds of pests and things, there are lots of things, and that's actually a whole class unto itself to be talking about pest control. But one of the best pieces of advice I can give novice gardeners is to be out in your garden all the time, so that if you're finding anything, you find it early. And one of the best ways to control things, if you find a leaf has started to get powdery mildew, pluck that leaf off and take it and put it in your garbage, not in your compost pile, put it in your garbage. Sometimes the simple act of just stopping something at the very beginning like that can prevent you from having much bigger problems later on. So being out in your garden and looking at your plants, touching your plants, and seeing what your plants are doing is the most important thing you can do for pest control. The next thing to go over really quickly is watering. It's probably the most common question we get in these sessions is, how often do I need to water my garden? And the answers vary. It depends on your soil, it depends on the weather, it depends on how you're watering. Now you'll see lots of advice online and get advice from other people that say you should never do overhead watering. You'll find people who say you should always do overhead watering. How you choose to water should be the method that gets your garden watered the best for you. Your garden soil should not dry out between waterings. It should always stay evenly moist. If your garden soil dries out between waterings, what happens is you're going to find you're growing vegetables that have a bitter taste possibly. You're going to find that you're going to grow vegetables that aren't as big, that don't produce as well, that the plants just don't produce as well. Most vegetables are mostly water, and they require lots of water to develop those sugars that give them the taste that we want. And so you have to remember that. So that's actually a thing that ties back to site selection, because you need to choose a site where you can get water to it easily. So if you pick a site that's way out and you're going to have to string 500 feet of hoses to get water to it, that may not be a very practical site. If you pick a site that's really close to the house, you'll be able to use it to get water to it in all likelihood more easily. As far as methods, you can install a drip system if you wanted to. Go to the expense and the effort of doing that. You can install soaker hoses. They're very inexpensive ways to get good water to your garden. And you can, if you really have to, use overhead watering. Just try to do it in the mornings so that the water that gets on leaves has a chance to evaporate, to dry off before the evening comes. So water, as far as how much, when we get to the early part of spring here, and we may be having rain, you may have stuff out like spinach, and you may have onions or potatoes out, and it may seem like the ground is getting too wet for them. And that can be true. One of the perils of gardening here in northwest Montana is sometimes we have such wet springs that things get too wet in the ground. You can try protecting them with tarps or something like that during a downpour. Generally speaking, you just kind of have to make sure that your site drains well and that your soil drains well. And if those things are true, you're going to get through most of those rainy days pretty well. Typically, you're going to have more trouble if your site doesn't drain well, or if your soil is too clayey that holds water too well. When we get to the hotter days of summer, you can be watering as much as twice a day, because your plants really want water, especially when they're producing those fruits, when they're producing the things you want to eat. That's when those are really trying to develop those sugars that give them those good flavors, and that requires lots and lots of water. So watering is really important for your vegetable garden. Now, the other thing to remember about your garden as you're planting it is that some crops are going to be done very early and some crops are going to take much later. Peas are a good example of a crop that we typically only harvest in the early season because it just gets too hot later in the summer for the peas to produce very well. And so we only are going to grow those in the early part of the season, which means we may have a container or we may have a spot where we could plant something else. Spinach and lettuce are another good example of something. As we get into the hotter days of summer, they're going to start to produce flowers. They're going to bolt, and they're just not going to be producing as much in those late days of summer in the home garden. So when you're planting your garden, you're going to need to learn something more about how those different plants, those different vegetables produce and at what times they all produce. That's a really broad, basic overview of gardening. There's all kinds of other things to learn about. We're going to do lots of these classes, but there's a few other things. One of the other things is supports for plants you're growing. I didn't get a tomato cage out of the shed, but that's those wire cages that you see that we put around our tomato plants. It's something you're going to have to think about as your plants get bigger. Tripods like this, or bigger versions of tripods like this, are something that you're going to have for something like pole beans that you're growing. Supports like this you might put on something like a tomatillo plant or a pepper plant. As that plant gets bigger, it may need to be staked to support for that stem, to support the weight of all those fruits. So there's all of this kind of stuff that we'll try to do some short classes on later that you need to learn about gardening. I have a feeling there's questions. Is that true? Michelle says not a single question. Okay. I hope there's enough people watching. So that's just a very basic, very broad overview of vegetable gardening. Now I'm going to talk about a handful of specific plants, or a handful of specific things that you're going to do in the garden. But we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about soil testing and soil amendment in a little bit more depth. So let's take a little break.